but also something I've been thinking about a lot is, first of all, thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Dr. Curtis Manning, Michelle Miner, everybody else who's here, the HNOC who helped me out a lot too to get ready for this. And just the passion for history here, it's so palpable. And I feel like I've learned so much thinking. I've learned so much as if I've taken several classes just in the past 45 minutes or 2 hours and yesterday, so it's really incredible. But one thing, I'm going to take another tack, okay? So it might be kind of blasphemous, maybe a little bit, I don't know, contemplative or something, but I think about the people who were there, all the participants, and what it took. I have a hard time imagining myself there, okay? I can't imagine myself fighting in this battle, although I admire everybody who was there and just the courage that it took. So that's one thing I think about, is the courage that it took to be part of this, no matter who you were. I think about the effort, the work that it took, all of those different things that had to be done in order to for example, get the carriages ready for the cannon, et cetera, all that stuff. Also, just the instinct, too, the instinct to survive. And this human element, Dr. Fandrich had mentioned the human element, and that's something that I'm going to really emphasize more in my presentation, is the individual, whoever it may be. And the absolute, for example, Jackson is a good example of somebody who perhaps he was irascible, and it's easy to look at him and say, well, this is Sharp Knife. This is somebody who killed many people. Native Americans have no reason to love him whatsoever. And yet, the work of history is to try to get beneath that kind of judgment. It's like, okay, sure, we can recognize that, but what was going on behind that? And he was a man of, as they say, iron will, but also instinct. And I think as we move along, there's instances where we can see he really had a sense of other people, and he could change his mind sometimes, even though he seemed stubborn, he could change his mind. And so an example, just to kind of bring out the scope of this, over the past couple of days, we've heard about the Napoleonic Wars. We've heard about, over time, the historiography. Dr. Yeomans had told us about this long history of telling the story of the history of the Battle of New Orleans, which is a great perspective on it, too. So right now I'm thinking about the Old Southwest. And I was reading a book by Buchanan. It's called Jackson's Way and the People of the Western Waters. And it was about really a series of conflicts that are pretty much forgotten. We sometimes refer to it as the Indian Wars, at least some of them in North America. And yes, indeed, we heard about the Creek Wars, or the Chickamaugas who were fighting back. This is a group of the Cherokee that didn't want to go along with these deals, say, no, we're going to fight. We're going to stand our ground. And then I think about an individual, and I can't help but admire her. Her name is Charlotte Reeves Robertson. I don't know if any of you have heard of her before, but in the 1780s, 1781 to be exact, she and her husband, James, were part of a pioneer group, and they're coming into what's now in the vicinity of Nashville. And in this one instance, in April of 1781, there was what they call the Battle of the Bluffs. And they had a fortified stockade, or we could just say a fort, and there was 25 armed men there. And these are all the pioneers. And there were hundreds of Chickamaugas, and I think there may have been other groups involved too, but primarily Chickamaugas, who were going to attack. And they had enticed the men to come out because they basically they heard them yelling, and they're like, okay, there's an advance party, we're gonna go, and what James Robertson and the others were thinking, we should go and hit them hard, we should come out and attack them. Well, they got lured into a trap, into an ambush. So all 25 armed men, all of the men of the fort, left the fort, and here they are in the woods. I think there might be canebrake, other different obstacles there. And the Native Americans have them trapped, hundreds of them, okay? And they actually have them surrounded. They ambush them. Almost instantly, half of these men are casualties, either killed or wounded outright, about, I think, 45% of them. And so they went ahead, they had to, they treed. They had to leave their horses, get behind trees, and start shooting back. They lost their horses, okay, the horses ran away. Now it looks really desperate, okay? So these guys are completely surrounded, half of them are already dead. And some of the Chickamaugas were waiting for the horses. Well, they made one mistake. They started going after some of the horses, and that left a little window open for them to come back. Now, this is where Charlotte Reeves Robertson comes in, because she's back in the fort. What to do, okay? She has hounds. They have, like, the proverbial dogs of war. She releases them, and as one writer put it, they boil down the hill, and they start attacking the Chickamaugas. Well, this gives the opportunity to the pioneers to come back into the fort and then they survive, well, the remnants of them, that is, and they're able to stave off hundreds of warriors based on Charlotte Reeves Robertson releasing these dogs of war just at the right time. So there's an instinct. It may have been a plan, but at the same time, the instinct to do that at the right moment. So that was just a kind of an opening salvo of what was happening at least a generation or more before the Battle of New Orleans, and thinking about individuals. So tonight, or this afternoon, I'm talking about Villere and his defense of New Orleans. I'm going to focus more, it's more of a biographical approach. And if you can read this here, there's some questions to ponder. When we talk about defense, when I invoke defense, besides protecting the city, what is being defended? And I think it's a good question to think about every individual, all the people who are involved, what are the possible reasons for fighting in this? And we know that people have different motivations. So as we think about that, how does Villere contrast with the other participants in the battle? This is somebody who's really not talked about because he doesn't have as much of a glamorous role, after all. He's not online Jackson. You don't really hear about him. I mean, he's mentioned a little bit, Eddie Price mentioned him, which I was really grateful for, but you know, he gets largely lost in the story. What are the economic motives, the political motives for the ancienne population of the Creoles, the French Creoles in Louisiana? It's going to be a little bit different from the Kentuckians. It's going to be a little bit different for other groups, the Choctaw Warriors, for example, who also fought alongside Jackson. And what are the outcomes, both the intended and unintended consequences of this battle? So all these things, I just want to invite you to think about these, and we'll return to these later, and hopefully you'll have some questions too in addition to these. Okay, so here's Major General Jacques Philippe Villere. His family has deep roots in Louisiana. In fact, his grandfather, Etienne, Roi de Villere, he was one of the founding, let's just say he was there in the early days. He was with Iberville during the campaigns coming to the Gulf Coast. There are records of him here in the 1720s. And by the way, for those of you who like to explore interesting connections, Etienne was born on January 8th, 1691. So some of you are familiar with the Kennedy, Lincoln, thing. Okay, something's going on there. I don't know what's going on. But his grandfather was born on January 8th. Okay, it's just a joke. Yeah, please, don't take that seriously. But then after Etienne, there's Joseph. And so now we're talking about Jacques' father. Joseph was part of a lot of things that came before, including the revolt of 1768. And as some of you may know, just a real brief recap, when the French colony was switched over to Spanish rule, a lot of the French Creole population didn't know about that, and they weren't too happy about it either. So it built up, and it took many years actually for Ulloa, the governor, the intended governor of Louisiana, to come, and he didn't have money to pay anybody, he didn't have the adequate troops. Okay, so there's rumblings of discontent, let's say, in the colony. And as it turns out, there was this full-blown revolt. This is now in October 1768. The Superior Council is meeting. Joseph Villere is there too. And they're deciding, you know what? We're not going to accept Ulloa. We're not going to accept the Spanish at all. And there is a full-blown revolt. They have a document called Il Manifeste. It's a manifesto of a kind of revolution, if you will. And I might add about, a decade before the Declaration of Independence. And they said, we don't belong to Spain because we belong to France. The French crown never asked us about leaving, so okay, we're going to stay. And as we know, O'Reilly comes, everything is forfeit. It doesn't work out for anybody, at least not for the French Creoles. And you can see here, Villere, this is Joseph Villere, Jacques' father, was one of the conspirators of the revolt. And he actually died very early in the whole conflict. He got taken into custody. According to one count, he was bayoneted to death. But in any case, we know that he died while in Spanish custody. And he's tried in absentia almost a year later saying, well, he's guilty. He's already dead. So they're going to execute him, I guess, twice. And it's like, okay, you're going to make sure you're really dead. Okay, well, Joseph Villere is part of this history of the family. And so just to think of the mindset where Jacques is coming from, what was animating his motives of all this. Now, Jacques Villere, just like his father and his grandfather, had military training. Specifically, let's say, well, he went to Saint-Domingue. He had a cousin in Saint-Domingue as a teenager. He did military training there. He also then went to France. Then during the Spanish regime, because he was only about, 8 or 9 years old when his dad died, he comes back to Louisiana, and he has to swear fealty to the Spanish crown. So that's a bit of a sticking point for him. But he serves under the Spanish, too. So he's a French soldier. He's a Spanish soldier. And then later when all of a sudden Louisiana becomes part of the United States, he has a lot of other things to do too. So after the purchase, is right after the state came into existence, he was already preparing to defend the city. And in February of 1813, he took command of the 1st Division of the Louisiana Militia, including men from all these different parishes: Plaquemine, St. Bernard, Orleans, St. Charles, St. John the Baptist, St. James, Ascension, Assumption, Lafourche, Iberville, West Baton Rouge, and Point Coupee parishes. Okay, so that was his technical role of taking control of the militia. Now, in September of 1814, and a little bit before too, I know there's kind of a time range there of August and September, but let's say by September, the British had sent a letter to Jean Lafitte, as we heard from Professor Chapman, and basically giving him an offer they can't refuse, like, hey, join us, and we'll take care of you, but just make sure you betray, these other guys, and you don't need to fight for the Americans anyway. And obviously, it's an offer that they can refuse, because they do refuse it, and they go to the authorities, the Americans, and General Villere is one of the guys who said, let's believe them, okay? This is actually a real letter. So both he and Claiborne were saying this is authentic. That's number one. Number two, later, as the Baratarians, as we heard earlier from the Masonic connection, Professor Chapman was talking about how the Baratarians, well, maybe there's a Masonic connection. That's possible. We want to keep an open mind about this. But at the same time, you think about people like General Villere, who's saying, let's let them go, let's let them fight. So there's also these kinds of conversations that are happening, not just with Jackson and Claiborne, but Villere and others. And some of these guys, and I think it must have been Dr. Fandrich who was saying, yeah, the French Creoles, they have these motives too. I mean, these pirates are keeping them supplied. So that makes perfect sense from that kind of pragmatic perspective. Okay. Now, a few days later, General Villere, he's telling the municipal council, we have to act, but a little earlier we heard about how there's perpetually no money, they don't have enough equipment, we know that we're waiting for some flatboats that come down later on, and not all the supplies get here in time, so we don't have the money. So because the governor is saying he has no funds, he says he has no funds available at his disposal, and doesn't even know how we can procure them, so we've got to do it. It falls on us. The responsibility is yours and mine. And so in response, some citizens say, well, here's $10,000. It's a little bit of a loaner, okay? Sounds pretty good. Actually, back then, that was a lot of money, of course. It still is, actually. Okay, but to provide the militia with provisions and other necessities. Okay, now a few days later, he wrote a letter to other militia officers saying circumstances are alarming, and now these are some of his duties. He already, as part of the municipal government, and he's also on the committee for the Constitutional Convention in 1812. Well, he has lots of duties. He says, we have to patrol frequently. He's telling everybody we have to patrol. We have to inspect the slaves, which really refers to a number of things, but includes, does it look like there's going to be some kind of organized revolt there too? Because just in the past couple of years, we had, it was the Haitian Revolution in Saint-Domingue. So they're thinking about that too. It could be some of the enslaved population might go over to the British side. They don't know. Look out for English spies and pay close attention to probable English invasion routes. And when Eddie Price was talking about this and showing us this map, and we saw the other maps yesterday too, I was thinking, gosh, there must have been dozens of ways, if not 100 ways, this could have played out. I mean, it's nothing short of a miracle that it kind of happened the way that it did, because the Brits could have come from many different directions, right, at the same time. So wow. And okay, so I might as well say this now. Okay, I'm a neophyte, so I hope you'll forgive me. I'm going to just go ahead and throw something out there as a submitted for your consideration. I hear a lot about the Villere plantation, the Villeres, and how, yes, indeed, that was the ingress, and that's how the Brits came in, okay? Sorry, I'm adopting the lingo of Brits, okay, the British people. Okay, they're coming in. And you know what? Okay, sure, maybe there might have been an oversight, but I don't know. There's some evidence that they didn't leave it open. In any case, can you think of a better way to have fought this battle than to have all the British coming in one area and then on the other side of the river, like sitting ducks in the end? Now, Jackson, with his instinct, has the Carolinas sitting there and then shooting down that line, but wow, it's like a bottleneck, So actually, it kind of worked out, So maybe whatever happened with the Villeres, it was actually a pretty good thing that they came in the way they did. Anyway, I'm just thinking about that because I can't think of any other scenario would be almost as desirable as this one, where everything's kind of lined up. Okay, that's my admittedly, speculative notion there. Okay, on December 1st, General Jackson arrived in New Orleans, and Villere is assigned to command the militia units near Lake Borgne and along the narrow area of Bayou Dupré. He was ordered to raise militia units in the parishes south and west of Baton Rouge. So he was out of the area. Then he comes back in December 30th, just in time, just about. He returns to New Orleans with several hundred men. With the 1st Division of Louisiana Militia and other units, he was ordered to take up a position behind the Pyrenees Canal and along and behind Bayou Dupré. And here is the map from Latour. We've already seen this. Yesterday, we're looking at this on January 8th. And here's a little bit of a close-up. And you can see here's line Jackson. And here's the second line of defense. This is where Villere is back here. So he's waiting. And as we heard again, if something, heaven forbid, something should happen to line Jackson, they have to fall back. That would be the next position that they would take. And so this is where Villere is with hundreds of soldiers waiting. And again, not the most glamorous in terms of like rockets' red glare, but still ready, okay? That was part of the background of the defense of the city. Okay, so after this, after things work out for the Americans, things work out for the city, because after all, as we know, Jackson looks like he was going to burn the town down. If things didn't work out, he was going to abscond, he was going to burn the town down. I'm sure that's not what Villere wanted to have happen. So talk about different motives, okay, different things going on with these people. A few years later, actually no, just a year later, Villere is elected governor. And so just like Jackson, there's a trajectory here. He has this military service. It's, by all accounts, solid. Well, he parlays this into a continued political career, because he already had one, of course. So this invites a little bit of a comparison. And I was thinking about this, and again, as a neophyte, I haven't read as deeply as some of you all about the histories, but just in scratching the surface, there are some very interesting things about them. So as it turns out, when Jackson was elected, first of all, everybody said the sky's falling. So here's some choice quotes. John Randolph, who we heard about before, Dr. Humans, he said, the country is ruined past redemption. There is an abjectness of spirit that appalls and disgusts me. Where now could we find leaders of a revolution? Okay, that's because Jackson got elected. Okay. The next one, Jackson is a man covered in crimes like oil or something like that. Okay, it's like, oh. And then the last one, the reign of King Mob is triumphant, Justice Story. So it's interesting to revisit previous elections and think about how people were reacting. Just kind of a side note about how history works, and we soon forget this, that people had reactions like this in the past. Well, as it turns out, Jackson, if we get past the very, let's just say, I don't want to say superficial, but yeah, the immediately apparent aspects of him as, say, the proverbial Indian killer, this guy who, aided and abetted slavery, for example. Okay, if we get past all that and we look at some of the other elements, he wanted to abolish the Electoral College. It's fascinating. A lot of people talk about that now. Let's abolish the Electoral College. Okay, for good or for bad, he was saying this all the way back then. He also believed all elected offices should be filled directly by the people. So, elected by the population. He always talked about the majority. He always talked about the citizens having a say in government, including the justices of the Supreme Court. That's really fascinating. And so what happened was, he said the Senate, the U.S. Senate, should be elected directly. Well, of course, that's what we do now. We did catch up there, but with the Supreme Court, we never did. So in a sense, I don't know if we ever will, but Jackson was saying we should do that too. It should be a direct election. Okay. Another thing is he didn't believe in debtors' prisons. And this is fascinating. You think about 1830, 80% of the jail in New England and the Middle States were debtors. Okay? Think about it. The vast majority of people, they were in jail because they were poor. 80%. That's really quite insane. Well, in 1832, a bill that eliminated imprisonment for debt was passed the House and the Senate, and within a decade, this penalty had disappeared from all states. And again, this is something that Jackson had envisioned. Okay, this is something he thought this is pretty reprehensible. Now, let's get to, sorry, actually one more thing about Jackson, pretty unusual. He also condemned the existence of a national debt. He said, a national debt is a national curse, and my vow shall be to pay the national debt. When's the last time you heard that, for crying out loud? Well, I guess we've heard it, but never gets fulfilled. Well, in 1835, he kept his promise, paid off the national debt, the only time this has been accomplished in U.S. history. Whoa, okay, kind of interesting. Now, getting to Governor Villere, this is a little bit different from Jackson, because Jackson was really into dueling, of course, demanding satisfaction. Well, Villere was responding to a long-standing, like a building movement against dueling, this kind of honor code. So an anti-dueling law was passed, and with the ultimate disincentive, which is if you win, even if you win, you lose. If you win the duel, you get killed. So why do it? Okay, so that kind of takes care of itself. He supports public education, and now this is when we start looking at the parallels between Jackson and Villere. The message to the legislature in 1818, the growth of the economy is such that Louisiana can extinguish its entire debt. All right? Governor Villere accomplished this by the end of his administration in 1820, even leaving a surplus of $40,000 in the state treasury. Again, pretty amazing, okay? And again, like maybe, I certainly didn't know this about Jackson, maybe you didn't either, and same is true with Villere. Fiscally pretty much on the ball, And again, you think about the defense of New Orleans and all the, again, more unglamorous things you have to do, the defense works, making sure that the militia has at least some firearm of some sort, that kind of stuff. This is like the background work. Well, he was thinking along these lines. And in January of 1819, to the state legislature, he says this: the friends of humanity have always lamented and do lament that the unfortunate debtor be confounded with a condemned malefactor and one in the same prison. And this barbarity dishonors our new era. So you will, I am confident, deem it important to put an end to an order of things so melancholy and disgraceful. So Governor Villere was anticipating the reforms that would come later in terms of debt reform. And so these are pretty significant impacts, I would submit. Okay, some other ideas about him. He was the first native-born Louisiana governor, spoke and wrote in French. So everything, all the times I'm quoting him, that's all originally in French, had to be translated into English. It was true, and every time he addressed the House of Representatives, the same deal. It had to be translated. Even though he was a Creole from Louisiana, a French-speaking Creole, he wanted to make sure his cabinet was mixed up a little bit, so he was appointing some so-called Americans to office too. So there's a continuity there. There's the continuing French Creole tradition, or the influence, and also the Americans coming in and speaking English. And finally, we recognize it in New Orleans especially, but all of Louisiana was becoming much more multilingual. It had been before, but it kind of waxes and wanes over language history. You'll have a place like New Orleans, for example, a while back, it was a very, very multilingual place. Now, it's only about 100 languages that are spoken. I know that sounds like a lot, but it's really not, actually, compared to LA and New York, so it's kind of funny. Well, this was presaging the future of the United States with many immigrants. So you're going to have all these other languages being spoken, but French was there beside English. So it wasn't just one or the other. It's not like one kicks out the other. Up through the middle of the 19th century, you had both languages being fairly predominant. But here is an example of Bernard Marigny reflecting on the campaign with Jackson, André Jackson, which I really like that a lot, this kind of francophilic treatment. I'm sure Andrew Jackson himself would love this, of course. And returning to the questions, when we talk about defense, besides the city and the population defending them, what else is being defended? Well, with Jacques Villere, obviously, by now, it's a way of life, his way of life as a planter. Unfortunately, that does include slavery. So he's thinking along these lines. He's thinking about maintaining what's there before, pretty different from what the Kentuckians are thinking about. They probably just want to get back home at this point. Well, in this case with Villere, and actually anybody else from here, they're defending their home. And so it matters quite a bit, actually, what happens in a lot of ways. How does Villere contrast with the other participants? Well, I mean, we see already that like Jackson and some others were much more visible. We remember them as being much more active in the actual battling itself. Villere has more of a background role, but he's still involved in these very important actions like making sure the Barratarians are involved. And say what you will, I think things would have turned out differently if we didn't have the Barratarians. So Villere, in addition to any other factors there may be, he was there on their side advocating for them. Economic and political motives, obviously very mixed. Like I said, there's a slavery system. The thing is, yeah, Jackson and these other guys who came from afar, they just don't share those, some of the same motives. And the outcomes. So a lot of them, pretty hard to imagine what could have happened if Jackson had left and burned the city down or somehow disabled it so the British couldn't use it. That would make a really big difference. So I want to thank you all very much for listening to me and participating in this history. It's very exciting, so thank you. Okay.